Have you ever experienced the bone-chilling moment when the people supposed to love you most look at you with pure disgust while celebrating your downfall as if it were a victory? My name is Lucille. I am 32 years old, and for nearly a decade I have been the invisible pillar holding my family's crumbling world together, while they treated me like an unwanted stranger in my own home. My sister Margo shoved me to the floor with such force that I felt the cold hardwood press against my ribs. Then she leaned over and spat directly on my head while calling me worthless trash. Instead of rushing to help their youngest daughter, my parents simply sat at the head of the table laughing at my humiliation as if it were the evening's entertainment. I did not scream or beg for an apology because I realized right then that my silent sacrifices had only fed their arrogance while depleting my own soul. I slowly bent down to pick up my professional ledger, which had been trampled under Margot's designer heels. Then I walked out the door without looking back a single time. By the following Monday, the luxury SUV was repossessed from her driveway, and every financial safety net I had built for them vanished overnight, leaving them to face the harsh reality of the debts they truly owed. Before we dive deeper into how I systematically dismantled the lavish lifestyle they stole from me, please let me know what time it is and which city you are watching from, so I can see how far my story has traveled. If you believe that respect is earned and toxic family ties should be severed without mercy, please hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to join our community. Your support helps me bring more of these reality check stories to life. So let's get into the details of the day. The free ride finally came to a crashing halt. Growing up in the rain-soaked suburbs of Portland, Oregon, taught me that some family dynamics are built on a foundation of shifting sand, where one child is the golden idol and the other is the sacrificial lamb. My sister Margo was born 4 years before me, and from the very beginning she was the crown jewel of my parents' existence, while I was merely the quiet shadow that followed in her wake. My father, who worked as a middle manager at a local furniture factory, always viewed Margo as his ticket to social prestige because she possessed the kind of effortless beauty and charisma that commanded attention in every room. My mother spent her days meticulously curating Margo's wardrobe and social calendar, ensuring that her eldest daughter was always at the center of the spotlight, while I spent my weekends alone in the library. While Margo was receiving expensive ballet lessons and designer gowns for her prom, I was wearing her hand-me-downs and learning how to balance the family checkbook because my parents were too preoccupied with her vanity to manage their own finances. This pattern of blatant favoritism did not end when we reached adulthood. In fact, it only intensified as Margo's life began to spiral into a series of failed business ventures and expensive divorces. I remember the day I graduated from college with honors in financial risk management, but instead of celebrating my achievement, my father asked if I could use my first paycheck to help Margo pay off her mounting credit card debt. My best friend Adrian was the only person who saw the toxic reality of my situation, and he often warned me that my family viewed me as a human ATM rather than a daughter or a sister. Adrian sat with me at a small coffee shop downtown and told me that I was setting myself on fire just to keep people warm who wouldn't even offer me a glass of water if I were dying of thirst. Despite his warnings, the deep-seated desire for parental approval kept me trapped in a cycle of enabling Margo's reckless behavior while I worked grueling 70-hour weeks at the bank. I became a senior debt specialist, a role that required me to be cold and analytical, yet I could never apply those same professional standards to the emotional manipulation my mother used against me every single Sunday. My mother had a way of sighing over the telephone that made me feel like the most selfish person on earth for wanting to keep my own hard-earned savings. She would talk about Margo's struggling social media career and her delicate emotional state, until I felt obligated to wire another $1,000 just to stop the guilt from gnawing at my stomach. My parents lived in a modest house that was slowly falling into disrepair, yet they insisted on maintaining the illusion of wealth by funding Margot's lavish lifestyle with the money I provided under the guise of family loyalty. I watched as they mortgaged their own peace of mind to keep Margo in the latest luxury vehicles, while I drove a 10-year-old sedan and lived in a tiny apartment on the edge of the city. Every time I tried to set a boundary, my father would remind me that family supports family and that my financial success was a shared asset rather than my own personal property. Margo never once thanked me for the thousands of dollars I funneled into her bank account. Instead, she acted as though I was lucky to be allowed to solve her problems. She would walk into my parents' house wearing a $3,000 coat that I had unknowingly paid for and complain about how boring my life was compared to her exciting adventures in the city. The resentment began to fester deep within me like a slow-growing poison, but I remained silent because I had been conditioned to believe that my worth was tied to my utility. I was the one they called when the furnace broke, or when the property taxes were overdue, but Margo was the one they invited to sit in the front row of every celebration. Adrian told me that the only way to win a rigged game is to stop playing, but I wasn't ready to walk away from the only family I had ever known until the day they finally pushed me too far. I spent my nights staring at spreadsheets that detailed exactly how much of my life had been stolen by people who didn't even respect me enough to remember my birthday. The numbers were staggering, revealing a total of over $150,000 in direct transfers, loan payments, and covered expenses over the last 7 years alone. I realized that I had effectively funded Margot's entire adult existence, while she treated me like a nuisance that she only tolerated for my wallet. My parents were not just passive observers in this dynamic, they were the chief architects of my misery, who used my sense of duty as a weapon against my own future. As I sat in my quiet apartment looking at the mountain of evidence I had collected, I realized that I was the only person who could break the chains that bound me to their insatiable greed. I began to quietly document every transaction and every co-signed agreement, preparing for a day that I hoped would never come, but felt more inevitable with every passing week. 2 years ago, the dynamic of our family shifted from subtle manipulation to outright financial parasitic behavior, following the spectacular collapse of Margot's third attempt at a boutique clothing line. My father called me in the middle of a high-stakes meeting at the bank, his voice trembling with a practiced desperation that I had unfortunately learned to recognize as the prelude to a significant financial request. He explained that Margo was on the verge of being evicted from her upscale apartment, and that her credit score was so abysmal that no legitimate landlord in Portland would even look at her application without a solid cosigner. Against my better judgment and the loud protests of my own intuition, I agreed to sign the lease for a luxury 2-bedroom condo in the Pearl District, thinking it would be a temporary bridge to her stability. I also found myself pressured into co-signing for a brand-new Lexus SUV after Margo claimed that her old car had become a safety hazard for her frequent trips to meet potential investors. My father looked me in the eye and promised that this would be the last time they ever asked for my help, but we both knew that was a lie intended to soothe my conscience for a few more months. Within the first 90 days, Margo missed 3 consecutive car payments and ignored the utility bills until the service providers began sending pink termination notices to my office address. I was forced to take over the monthly payments of $1,200 for a vehicle I never drove, all while Margo posted photos of herself sipping champagne in the driver's seat, with captions about hard work and manifestation. Every time I confronted her about the mounting debt, she would laugh and tell me that I was being too dramatic about a few $1,000s when I clearly had plenty of money to spare. My parents backed her up completely, with my mother suggesting that I should be grateful for the opportunity to provide for my sister during her supposed time of need. They lived in an alternate reality where my labor was a natural resource intended for Margot's consumption, and any attempt to reclaim my autonomy was viewed as a personal attack on the family unit. I spent my evenings reviewing the legal documents of the co-signing agreements, realizing that I had effectively handed Margo a blank check drawn from my own future and retirement savings. I watched my own bank account stagnate while Margo's wardrobe expanded her closet, filling with designer bags and shoes that cost more than my monthly mortgage. I began to feel like a ghost in my own life, a silent provider who was only summoned when a bill needed to be paid or a crisis needed to be managed with a credit card. Margo would call me at 2 in the morning to complain about her neighbors or her latest romantic disappointment, but she would never ask how my day was or if I was struggling with the workload I carried. I realized that she didn't see me as a human being with feelings and aspirations, but rather as a highly efficient machine that produced capital for her convenience. My father started dropping hints that Margo needed a new laptop for her creative projects, suggesting that my old one was surely insufficient for someone with her artistic temperament. I refused that request, which resulted in a 2-week silent treatment from my parents that felt more like a blessing than a punishment in the beginning. However, the guilt eventually pulled me back into their orbit, and I found myself buying the laptop just to restore the fragile peace that kept our family from shattering. I was paying for Margo's health insurance, her cell phone plan, and even her streaming service subscriptions, because she claimed that these were essential tools for her career. The total monthly drain on my finances was approaching $4,000, a staggering sum that forced me to cancel my own vacation plans and delay the repairs on my house. I felt the weight of their expectations pressing down on my chest every single day, making it difficult to breathe or find any joy in the success I had worked so hard to achieve. Adrian told me that I was being robbed in broad daylight by the people who were supposed to be my protectors, and for the first time, I couldn't find a single argument to defend them. I started keeping a secret ledger in my desk at work, a meticulous record of every penny I spent on Margo and my parents, including the dates and the hollow promises of repayment that were never kept. I saw the numbers climbing toward the $200,000 mark and realized that I could have owned my own home outright if I hadn't been subsidizing their vanity. The resentment was no longer a slow burn. It was a raging fire that I struggled to contain whenever I had to sit through a family dinner and listen to Margo brag about her luxury lifestyle. I was the silent architect of her comfort, yet I was treated like a footnote in the story of her supposed success. My parents continued to enable her delusions, telling anyone who would listen that Margo was a visionary who just needed a little more time to find her footing in the world. They never mentioned that her footing was bought and paid for by the daughter they chose to ignore whenever she wasn't writing a check. I felt a cold resolve beginning to form in the pit of my stomach, a realization that I was the only one who could end this cycle of abuse by choosing to value myself more than the approval of people who didn't love me. I knew that the next time they pushed me, I wouldn't just bend, I would break away from them entirely and take back the life they had stolen piece by piece. The months leading up to the final confrontation were characterized by a deceptive calm as I began to strategically move my assets out of their reach while maintaining the appearance of a dutiful daughter. I spent my lunch breaks consulting with a colleague at the bank who specialized in asset protection and contract law, ensuring that I understood every legal avenue available to me. I discovered that because I was the primary payer on the luxury condo lease and the sole payer on the Lexus SUV, I had the legal right to terminate the agreements if I could prove a consistent pattern of non-payment by the primary occupant. I began to gather every bank statement, every ignored invoice, and every text message where Margo admitted she had no intention of paying me back. My father had no idea that I was building a case against the very person he spent every waking hour protecting, and my mother was too busy planning Margo's next birthday party to notice my growing distance. I felt a strange sense of power as I realized that the financial strings I had used to support them were also the very cords I could use to bind them when the time was right. I was no longer the frightened girl who craved their love. I was a high-level financial analyst who was treating her own family like a bad investment that needed to be liquidated. Adrian helped me find a new apartment in a secure building that required a key card for entry, a place where Margo and my parents wouldn't be able to ambush me with their demands. I began to move my personal belongings into storage one box at a time so they wouldn't notice the gradual disappearance of my presence from the life they thought they controlled. I also contacted the insurance company and the utility providers to let them know that I would be removing my name from the accounts on a specific date in the near future. I felt a dark satisfaction in knowing that the luxury world Margo had built for herself was actually a house of cards that would collapse the moment I stopped holding up the walls. My parents continued to treat me with a dismissive arrogance, confident that I would always be there to clean up Margot's messes and fund their collective delusions of grandeur. They even had the audacity to ask if I would pay for a family cruise to celebrate Margot's latest Instagram milestone, a request so absurd that I almost laughed in my father's face. I told them I would think about it, a phrase they interpreted as an eventual yes, which gave me the cover I needed to finalize my exit strategy without raising suspicion. I was living a double life, playing the part of the ATM while secretly preparing to declare bankruptcy on our relationship. I watched Margo flaunt her new designer clothes and talk about her expensive skincare routine, all while knowing that her access to my bank account was about to be permanently revoked. I felt a surge of adrenaline every time I signed another document that moved me closer to freedom, a feeling of liberation that I hadn't experienced since I was a child. My mother tried to guilt me into buying a new sofa for their living room, claiming that the old one was embarrassing when Margot's friends came over to visit. I told her that my finances were a bit tight this month, which resulted in a lecture from my father about the importance of generosity and the bonds of blood. He didn't realize that the blood between us had turned cold a long time ago, and that his lectures no longer had any power over my decisions. I was counting down the days until the lease on my own apartment was up, and I could vanish into the city without leaving a trail for them to follow. I even set up a new bank account at a different institution and moved the bulk of my savings there, leaving only enough in the old account to cover the automatic payments until the day of the final split. I felt like a spy in my own family, observing their behavior with a detached curiosity and a growing sense of disgust at their entitlement. Margo once told me that I was lucky to have a sister like her to keep my life interesting, a comment that I recorded in my mental ledger of reasons to never look back. She truly believed that she was doing me a favor by letting me pay her bills and solve her problems, as if my only purpose in life was to serve her vanity. I realized that my parents had raised her to be a narcissist and had raised me to be her enabler, but they had underestimated my intelligence and my capacity for cold, calculated retaliation. I spent my nights reviewing my plan, checking for any loopholes that they might try to exploit to keep me under their thumb. I knew that once I made my move, there would be no going back, and that the fallout would be catastrophic for their social and financial standing. I was prepared for the tears, the screaming, and the accusations of betrayal, because I knew that the real betrayal had already happened years ago. Every time I looked at Margo, I saw a predator who had been feasting on my life for far too long, and I was ready to finally cut off her food supply. My father's arrogance was the final piece of the puzzle. His absolute certainty that I was too weak to ever stand up to him gave me the perfect cover to plan his downfall. I was no longer a victim. I was an architect of justice, and the blueprint for their reality check was finally complete and ready to be executed. Sunday dinner was supposed to be a celebration of my father's 65th birthday, but it quickly devolved into a theater of cruelty that finally shattered the last remaining threads of my loyalty. The evening began with a tension so thick it felt like a physical weight in the dining room of my parents' house in Portland, where the smell of roast beef mingled with the stale scent of my sister's expensive perfume. Margo had arrived late as usual, draped in a silk wrap that I knew had been charged to the emergency credit card I had given her for groceries and gas. She spent the first hour of the meal complaining about the quality of the wine and the lack of proper lighting for her social media stories, while my parents hung on her every word like devoted disciples. I sat at the end of the table, a silent observer to the spectacle of their dysfunction, until my father decided it was time to address the elephant in the room. He cleared his throat and announced that Margo had a brilliant new idea for a lifestyle brand and that she would need an initial investment of $50,000 to get it off the ground. He didn't ask if I had the money or if I was willing to help. He simply stated that since I was the successful one in the family, it was my responsibility to ensure Margo's success. When I quietly replied that I was no longer in a position to fund her business ventures, the atmosphere in the room changed from festive to toxic in a matter of seconds. Margo's face contorted with a rage that was both terrifying and pathetic as she stood up and accused me of trying to sabotage her future out of jealousy. She screamed that I was a boring bean counter who would never understand the vision of an artist, and that my money was the only thing that made me tolerable to be around. My mother didn't tell her to sit down or to be respectful. Instead, she looked at me with a cold disappointment and asked why I was being so difficult on my father's special day. The argument escalated as I stood my ground, refusing to be bullied into another financial suicide mission for a woman who hadn't worked a day in her life. That was when Margo snapped. She lunged across the small space between us and shoved me with both hands, sending me stumbling back until I tripped over my own chair and landed hard on the hardwood floor. The impact sent a jolt of pain through my hip, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the shock of seeing my sister standing over me with a look of pure malice. Then, in an act of such profound disrespect that it felt like a dream, she leaned down and spat directly onto my forehead, the warm liquid trickling down my face like a brand of shame. "You're just worthless trash, Lucille," she hissed, her voice dripping with a contempt that had been simmering for years. "You're nothing but a tool for this family, and don't you ever forget that you're only here because we allow you to be." I waited for my father to roar in anger or for my mother to gasp in horror, but the only sound that filled the room was the jarring rhythmic noise of my parents laughing. My father let out a deep, booming chuckle as he took a sip of his wine, while my mother giggled into her napkin like a schoolgirl watching a prank go exactly as planned. They weren't shocked by Margo's violence, they were entertained by it as if my humiliation was the perfect dessert to their birthday feast. I stayed on the floor for a long moment, the world around me spinning into a blur of betrayal and realization that I had spent my life loving people who truly hated me. I looked up at them, at the three people who were supposed to be my home, and I saw only strangers who viewed me as a commodity to be used and discarded. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, and I didn't even try to wipe the spit from my face as I slowly pushed myself up from the ground. I reached down and picked up my leather-bound ledger, which had been knocked off the table and trampled under Margo's high heels during the scuffle. I looked at the muddy footprint on the cover, a symbol of everything they had done to my dignity, and I felt a cold, crystalline peace settle over my heart. "I hope you enjoyed the show," I said, my voice so calm and level that it seemed to startle them for the first time that evening. Margo rolled her eyes and told me to stop being such a drama queen, while my father told me to sit back down and finish my dinner like a sensible adult. I didn't say another word to them. I simply turned around and walked out of the dining room, down the hallway, and out the front door into the cool Portland night. I could hear them laughing behind me as the door clicked shut, a sound that I knew would be the last thing I ever heard from them in that house. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the steering wheel and feeling the weight of the past decade finally lifting off my shoulders. The realization that I owed them nothing was like a sudden burst of light in a dark room, illuminating the path to a future where I was no longer their slave. I drove straight to Adrian's house, and when he saw the look on my face and the spit still drying on my forehead, he didn't ask any questions. He just handed me a warm towel and a glass of water. "It's time, isn't it?" he asked softly, and I nodded, feeling the fire of retaliation finally beginning to burn with a steady, unstoppable heat. I spent the rest of the night at his kitchen table, not in tears, but in a focused frenzy of action as I logged into every account and began the process of severing our lives. I was no longer a daughter or a sister. I was the cold hand of consequence that they had spent years inviting into their lives, and the bill was finally coming due. At exactly 8 o'clock on Monday morning, I was sitting in the glass-walled office of Sterling, a no-nonsense attorney who specialized in high-stakes contract litigation and asset recovery. I handed him a thick folder containing the co-signing agreements, the bank statements showing 7 years of consistent payments, and the documented evidence of Margo's repeated breaches of our informal repayment terms. Sterling reviewed the documents with a grim efficiency, his eyebrows rising as he calculated the total amount of money I had funneled into my sister's luxury lifestyle. "You've been incredibly generous, Lucille," he remarked, his voice devoid of judgment, but heavy with the weight of legal reality. "But that generosity has now created a clear path for us to terminate these obligations immediately." He explained that because the Lexus SUV was registered in my name as the primary owner, and Margo was merely the permitted driver, I had the legal right to revoke that permission at any time. We drafted a formal notice of repossession, which was sent via a specialized courier to Margo's condo, informing her that the vehicle would be retrieved within 48 hours by a licensed recovery agent. Next, we addressed the luxury condo lease, where Sterling found a clause that allowed the primary guarantor to withdraw their support if the occupant engaged in activities that threatened the guarantor's financial security. I signed the paperwork to terminate my guarantee of her rent, a move that would trigger an automatic eviction process since Margo's own credit score was too low to sustain the lease on her own. I felt a surge of cold satisfaction as I watched Sterling stamp the documents, each one a nail in the coffin of the artificial world Margo had built for herself. After leaving the law office, I spent the afternoon on the phone with utility companies, insurance providers, and the cell phone carrier, systematically removing my payment information from every account associated with Margo and my parents. I informed the electric company in Portland that I was no longer responsible for the bill at Margo's address, and that they should contact the occupant for a new deposit if they wanted to avoid a service interruption. I called the insurance agent and canceled the high premium policy on the Lexus, knowing that Margo wouldn't be able to afford the basic coverage required by law once she was on her own. I even contacted the private health club where Margo had a platinum membership on my dime and informed them that my credit card was to be removed from their system effective immediately. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I had effectively liquidated the financial foundation of Margo's entire life, leaving her with no car, no guaranteed housing, and no way to maintain the illusion of her social status. I didn't stop there. I also contacted my parents' bank and informed them that I would no longer be providing the monthly subsidy that covered their property taxes and home insurance. I knew this would force my father to finally tap into the small retirement fund he had been hoarding while he spent my money, or perhaps he would have to sell the house he had refused to maintain. I felt no guilt as I made these calls because the sound of their laughter from the night before was still ringing in my ears, reminding me of exactly what they thought of my worth. Adrian met me for coffee afterward and told me that he had never seen me look so calm, as if the act of taking back my life had restored a part of my soul that had been missing for years. I told him that it wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the fundamental principle of respect and the realization that blood is not a valid excuse for abuse. I spent the evening in my new apartment, a place they would never find, surrounded by the few boxes I had moved in secret over the past month. I turned off my old phone and placed it in a drawer, choosing to use a new number that was only known to Adrian and Sterling. I realized that for the first time in my adult life, every dollar in my bank account belonged to me, and every hour of my day was mine to spend as I pleased. The silence of my new home was a beautiful, haunting melody that celebrated the end of my servitude and the beginning of my autonomy. I knew that Margo would likely be waking up to a series of increasingly frantic notifications and phone calls, but I was no longer the person who would rush to her side to fix the damage. I had provided the safety net for 7 years, but now the net was gone and the ground was rushing up to meet them with a speed they never anticipated. I imagined my father's face when he realized that the worthless trash had finally taken herself out and had taken her resources with her. I felt a sense of closure that no apology could ever provide, a realization that the best revenge was not just living well, but living entirely without them. I was no longer the sacrificial lamb of the Harrison family. I was a woman who had reclaimed her power through the very tools they had used to exploit her. As the sun set over the Portland skyline, I felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that the storm I had unleashed was not a tragedy, but a long overdue correction of a cosmic imbalance. The fallout began on Wednesday morning when the reality of my departure finally collided with the fragile illusions of Margot's world in a spectacular display of social and financial ruin. I was sitting in a quiet park near my new apartment when I decided to check the email account I had set up specifically for legal communications from my family. The inbox was overflowing with messages from my father, his tone shifting from arrogant demands for an explanation to hysterical accusations of elder abuse and familial betrayal. He wrote that Margo had been humiliated in front of her neighbors when a tow truck arrived to repossess the Lexus while she was loading her gym bags into the trunk for her morning workout. Apparently, she had tried to argue with the recovery agent, but when he produced the paperwork I had signed with Sterling, she was left standing on the sidewalk with nothing but her designer purse. My mother sent a series of frantic emails claiming that the landlord of the condo had already served them with a 3-day notice to provide a new guarantor or face immediate eviction proceedings. She begged me to reconsider, telling me that family doesn't do this to each other, and that I was breaking her heart by being so cruel to my own flesh and blood. I read their words with a detached interest, feeling as though I was reading the script of a bad soap opera rather than a real crisis involving people I once cared about. Margot's emails were the most revealing, filled with a toxic mixture of rage and desperation, as she realized that her life of leisure was coming to a violent end. She threatened to sue me for emotional distress and for the theft of the car, seemingly unaware that her name was never on the title, and that I had paid every single cent for its operation. She even tried to claim that the spit at the dinner table was a joke that I had taken too far, an excuse so pathetic that it only reinforced my decision to never speak to her again. By Friday, the situation had deteriorated even further as the utility companies followed through on the service terminations I had requested on Monday. My parents were forced to move Margo and all of her belongings into their small, cluttered house because she had no way to pay for a hotel or find a new apartment on such short notice. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that the atmosphere in my parents' home was like a war zone, with Margo screaming at my father for not being able to fix the situation and my mother weeping over the loss of their social standing. The golden child was now a permanent houseguest in a home that could barely afford to feed her, and the resentment that they had previously directed at me was now being turned toward each other. My father had to go back to work part-time at a local hardware store just to cover the basic living expenses that I had previously handled without complaint. He was 65 years old and forced to stand on his feet for 8 hours a day because he had spent his savings on Margot's vanity instead of his own future. I felt a sharp pang of irony knowing that the man who had laughed while I was on the floor was now the one struggling to keep his head above water. Margot's social media career evaporated almost overnight, as she no longer had the luxury background or the expensive car to maintain her influencer persona. Her followers began to drop off when she started posting from the cramped guest bedroom of my parents' house, her photos no longer reflecting the aspirational lifestyle she had built on my back. I watched from a distance as the life they had constructed out of my labor crumbled into dust, leaving them with nothing but the bitter reality of their own choices. They tried to find me showing up at my old apartment and my office at the bank, but I had already moved and informed my HR department that I was being harassed by estranged relatives. The security guards at the bank had a photo of my father and Margo with strict instructions to deny them entry and call the police if they refused to leave the premises. I realized that the only way to protect my peace was to treat them like the threat they truly were, a group of predators who would stop at nothing to regain access to my resources. My mother sent one final email, a long and rambling message about how I would regret my heartlessness when they were gone, but I simply deleted it without a second thought. I knew that their suffering was not my fault. It was the natural consequence of their own greed and their refusal to treat me with basic human decency. I had been the one who carried the weight of the family for 7 years, and now that I had dropped the load, they were finally feeling the true gravity of their own lives. Adrian told me that the most powerful thing a person can do is to walk away from a table where respect is no longer being served, and I had done exactly that. I was no longer interested in their apologies or their explanations, because I knew that they were only sorry that the money had stopped flowing. The realization that they only valued me for my utility was a painful truth to accept. But once I embraced it, I was finally free from the need for their approval. I spent my weekends exploring Portland on my own terms, visiting the places I had always wanted to see, but never had the time or money to enjoy because I was too busy working to support them. I felt like a traveler in a new land, discovering a world where my worth was not determined by how much I could give, but by who I was as a person. The fallout was complete, and as the dust settled, I saw a clear path forward to a life that was finally, truly mine. 1 month after the night I walked out of my parents' house, the silence of my new life has become the most precious thing. I own a sanctuary where the echoes of their laughter and Margot's insults can no longer reach me. I have settled into a routine that prioritizes my own well-being, spending my mornings drinking coffee on my balcony overlooking the Willamette River, and my evenings reading the books I used to have to hide. My career at the bank has flourished now that I am no longer distracted by the constant emergencies and financial crises that Margo used to manufacture to keep me under her control. I received a significant promotion and a raise, ironically because my supervisors noticed a dramatic increase in my focus and productivity since I simplified my personal life. I have blocked every avenue of communication from my parents, and Margo leaving the legal matters in the capable hands of Sterling, who recently informed me that the judgments for the documented loans have been officially recorded. This means that if Margo ever manages to acquire any assets in the future, I will be the first in line to collect the money she stole from me under the guise of sisterly love. I heard through Adrian that my father had to sell his beloved classic truck just to pay the back taxes on their home, a vehicle he had prized above almost everything else in his life. Margo is reportedly working as a receptionist at a dental office, a job she loathes and considers beneath her, but it is the only place that would hire her given her lack of skills and her history of entitlement. My mother is no longer seen at the local social clubs because she can no longer afford the membership fees or the designer outfits that were the ticket to her social vanity. They are living a life of quiet desperation in a house that feels much smaller now that the golden child is a permanent and bitter resident of the spare bedroom. I sometimes wonder if they ever sit around that dining table and regret the night they laughed while I was on the floor, or if they are still convinced that I am the villain in their story. It doesn't really matter anymore, because their opinion of me has no power to change the reality of the peace I have found in my own autonomy. I have learned that family is not a biological mandate that requires you to accept abuse. It is a choice made every day through mutual respect and genuine support. If the people who share your blood do not share your values or respect your boundaries, then you have every right to remove them from your life without a single ounce of guilt. I spent years trying to buy the love of people who were incapable of giving it, and the most important lesson I have learned is that you cannot fix a broken person by breaking yourself in the process. My life is now a testament to the power of walking away a journey that began with a shove and a spit, but ended with a reclaimed soul and a future that is entirely my own. I have built a new family of choice, a small circle of friends like Adrian, who value me for my heart and my mind, rather than the balance of my bank account. I no longer feel the need to justify my success or apologize for my boundaries. I simply exist as a woman who knows her own worth and refuses to let anyone else define it. Looking back at the girl who used to cry in her car after writing checks for people who hated her, I feel a deep sense of compassion and a fierce pride that she finally found the strength to snap. The worthless trash has turned out to be the most valuable asset I ever possessed, a core of resilience and self-respect that survived the fire of their contempt. I am living proof that you can survive the betrayal of your family and come out the other side stronger, wiser, and more at peace than you ever thought possible. Thank you for listening to my story and for walking this difficult path with me until the very end. If you have ever felt like the invisible pillar of your family, or if you have been treated like a tool instead of a human being, I hope my journey gives you the courage to stand up and reclaim your own life. Please remember that silence is not weakness, it is the quiet before the storm of your own liberation, and you deserve to be surrounded by people who celebrate your existence rather than exploit it. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to cut off a toxic family member or set a boundary that felt impossible? Your stories of resilience help us all realize that we are not alone in these struggles, so please share your perspective and join the conversation below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe. If you haven't already, your support allows me to keep sharing these reality check stories that remind us all of the power of self-respect. Until next time, take care of yourself, value your peace, and never let anyone